Good day, everybody. Hopefully everybody has a good lunch. I think there were still sandwiches left over, right? Good. As everybody knows, today right now is June 17th, and on Saturday this week, we celebrated the Army's birthday. Today, though, is also a very special anniversary, and so we're picking up and still staying on that theme of the Army's 250th birthday. And what we're going to do today is discuss the birth of the American Army. Really, what you have going on today is the Continental Congress is still putting in all the necessary assets to actually raise and fund an American Army. And so on this day, it would be actually Saturday in 1775, this is when General Washington actually accepted his appointment as the Commander-in-Chief of the United Continents Army. Also, does anybody else know what anniversary this is? The Boston guy. It is. And so this was a very appropriate day to do this. Our agenda today is kind of to talk about, again, the powder keg that was Boston. A little bit about the Sons of Liberty. And one of the guys I want to kind of focus this and tie a lot of this lecture into is a guy by the name of Dr. Joseph Warren. We'll also talk about Lexington and Concord, that initial shot heard around the world in the militia system. Then we'll talk about the New England Army of Observation, the army that sieged Boston. Then we'll kind of talk about the Second Continental Congress and what was going on in the colonies at that time. The Battle of Bunker Hill, as we said, today's the anniversary, and the death of Dr. Warren there. And then a little bit about the establishment of the Continental Army and what was historically significant about 1775 specifically. The hope is to draw a few conclusions on how the fledgling force was able to best the most superior, technology superior, and most dominating army in the world at the time. So a little bit about the powder keg that was Boston. So at this point, the colonies they're operating very much autonomous. But the British government is trying to recruit funds after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And so now it's time they think their process is to levy taxes on the colonies to repay this. They recoup the benefits of the British protection, so they should pay for it. And so you have things like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Well, the colonists don't like that, and particularly it's a rebellion. They rebel against these things. And Boston becomes kind of that central hub of that rebellion. You have, what's known as the Boston Massacre, when the people were heckling the British soldiers on the Boston Commons. And you had the first massacres of the war. The slaying of Christopher Snyder, kind of seen as that first martyr, 11-year-old kid that was in Boston. The HMS Gaspee affair. So that was a British ship that was actually chasing a smuggler that ran aground. The Sons of Liberty then went out and burned that ship. Boston Tea Party. As all these things are happening, the British Crown now is kind of fed up, and Boston now is occupied. It is an occupied city by the British government. And so then they also instill what was known as the coercive acts or the intolerable acts. From this point, like I said, Boston is a occupied city. Its harbor is closed. And now it's under military martial law. Well, be honest with you, the British have no clue how to deal with this kind of affair. The American colonies are far different from all their other colonies. All their other colonies are pretty much kind of ruled with an iron fist. The American colonies are far different because they're British citizens. And so they kind of used a hands-off approach to it, and that was fine until, again, we started trying to recoup these taxes. And now, so this thing has persisted now for 10 years, and they don't know how to deal with it. And so they're going to deal with it the same way they always did, and that's with an iron fist. That doesn't go over well. Then you have the Sons of Liberty. That is the resistance. They're a bunch of spies, smugglers. They use propaganda, riots, boycotts, everything else they can to basically kind of disrupt what's going on. A lot of this, too, they will go and harass loyalist merchants as well. They use all kinds of recruitment, misinformation, and they're also stockpiling arms and munitions. As early as 1773, it is really, particularly Massachusetts Bay Colony, is preparing for a war. They know something's coming. They're starting to amass arms and particularly gunpowder. That was the real sticking point. You also have now organizations that are trying to coerce other colonies. And you get to have the Committee for Correspondence and Inspections in Public Safety. Joseph Warren is actually one of the leading founders of that. And then they also are the first people to, as far as Massachusetts go, send their delegates to the First Continental Congress. One thing I'll kind of hit on here, this is very much a populist movement at this point. As we'll kind of discuss too, the colonies are very much torn. And this is really, in a lot of ways, kind of our first Civil War. We don't know which side you're on. And so it is very much a civil war within the colonies themselves. Dr. Warren himself, very interesting character. And we actually have a descendant we know of the Warren family with us today. So that was really cool. He's Harvard trained as far as being a doctor. He was a widow, but he already had 4 children, and he had a fiancée at this time as well, but they were not married. He's one of the leading founders of the Sons of Liberty movement, but he's smart enough to be in the background of it, and he's running a lot of the spy networks. He's known to be a orator. He's the founder of that Committee of Correspondence, writing letters that's going to all the other colonies. He had got to be such a pain in the butt for General Gage that they actually had a plot to arrest him or kill him on the 5th anniversary of the Boston Massacre. So this would be now in March of 1775. Dr. Warren dresses up like Cicero and is going into the Boston Commons and gives a huge oration. And British officers are actually in plain clothes and there to try to arrest him or kill him on there. But somewhere in there, Dr. Warren has enough spies and everybody, and they're detected. Somebody fires a shot and a warning shot, and Dr. Warren is able to escape out a window and escape arrest. He's a kind of a master of the spy game. It is thought that Margaret Gage, the wife of Thomas Gage, who is the military governor now of Boston for the British Army, that is his spy connection. That has never been totally proven, but I kind of think it's possibly very true. It is Dr. Warren who finds out that the British are actually going to go out to Lexington and Concord on the time that we do now is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And he's actually the person that alerts Paul Revere and William Doss to actually start spreading the word that the British are coming. After Lexington and Concord, he's actually elected as the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. From there, he actually drafts a letter, as we'll talk about in a minute, that actually is prolific in the discussions with the Second Continental Congress. On the establishment of the Army on the 14th of June, he's actually commissioned with no real prior military experience as a major general. One of the first people to be commissioned as a general officer the day of 14 June. But then, on the day of Bunker Hill, he will fight at the redoubt at Breed's Hill as a private. And he volunteered to fight as a private on that day. And of course, he will die on that day as now one of the first martyrs of the foundation of our nation. And so you can see engraving there when he's going to Israel Putnam and asking to fight there on Breed's Hill. And like I said, he was a galvanizing figure at the redoubt there at Breed's Hill. And you can see here, this is a letter that he wrote to his mother, just to kind of give you a frame of where his mindset was, is wherever danger is, dear mother, there will be your son. Be now is no time for what American child to shrink from the most hazardous duties. I will either set my country free or shed my last drop of blood to make it so. So it gives you a little bit of the mindset of where he was. What did I just do? Oh, okay, we didn't. I had to turn it off. I'm sorry. 19 April of 1775, the Lexington Concord fight. As we said before, the British were really inched. Yeah, all right. I'm sorry. The British were very interested in, like I said, arms and armament, particularly powder, when they do the Patriots were storing that. And so they were going to get this stash of powder that they knew that was at Concord. A couple months prior to that, you had what was called the powder alarm incident. And that was up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a little bit further north. And the British had gone out to seize, again, another tower that had powder that the militia had stored. They were able to retrieve all that powder, but in doing so, the Minutemen came out from everywhere. And the British basically had to kind of ducktail and skirt back into Boston, kind of really had been, made a fool of, really. And so they weren't going to have that happen again. And so when they set out on the night of the 16th of April, or 17th of April, they were going out 700 men strong on that. So they weren't going to have that same thing happen again. On the morning of the 19th, again, the Minutemen had already come out, and you have the first standoff there on the green there at Lexington. Captain Parker he's telling his men not to fire, don't engage. Their whole tactic of that first 80-man force was actually just to stall the British, so that the arms and armament at a Concord could get out of there. Also, you had Sam Adams and John Hancock that were there, and they had to scoot out of there as well, because, again, the British were trying to attempt to arrest them. But somewhere there was that unknown shot. That shot heard around the world, and just kind of that shot heard around the world was a Joseph Warren from one of his committee of correspondence letters that he wrote after this, is where we have that from. But anyway, the first shot is heard. Nobody knows where that comes from. But then you have an exchange of fire between the 80-man militia force and about a 300-man British force. That does not go well for the militia, and 8 guys are killed and 10 are wounded. And what I have up here, just kind of to talk about that a little bit, again, as we talk about the militia force, the militiamen, for the most part, are armed with their civilian arms. They don't have military arms at that time. And so they're armed specifically mainly with Pennsylvania rifles. It's a 50 caliber rifled musket, and it takes a long time to be able to load it. You have to be able to do your shots individually. You measure powder individually. It takes a long time to load the device. At the time, a military arm of the time, and you think of something like the British Shortland powder and Brown Bess that we have up here, is a 75 caliber smoothbore. So it's much easier to load, and a lot of times they would use what's called a buck and ball. So you'd have a smaller main lead ball, followed by anywhere from 3 to 6 smaller shots that were behind that. So you almost had an effect, a shotgun kind of effect when you go out there. So the principle really wasn't to aim, but just to get as much shot as you could out there, and hopefully you would hit something. The other thing that was on a military arm was the bayonet. And that was one of the crucial tools of the time. And so after this first volley happened, the bayonet charge ensued after that. And the militia then left the field. The British go ahead and they can proceed on to Concord and the Old North Bridge. And at that point, you have the second fighting that occurs. This time, the militia had changed the favor into their point. And so now there's only about 80 to 90 British that are holding the North Bridge. That was the route back. and 400 militia charge on them. And from that point on, the British now are in a retrograde back into Boston. This 700-man force back in Lexington meets up with a reinforcement of over 1,000. And so now you have 1,700 British soldiers that are making a running gunfight all the way back into Boston. The militia was coming out all through the woods, harassing fire all along the flanks, and just kept harassing the British all the way back into Boston. From there, you have what's called now basically the siege. From soon as the army went back into Boston, this army, patriots now, Minutemen, started to siege the rest of Boston. But who were they as much? The whole militia force, essentially, you have males between anywhere from 16 up to 60. They're there in there defending their hometowns, defending them against arms. And so it's very much as a local force. You have what's called the Minutemen. And what you have is really anywhere from 25 to a third of your force is always on an alert status where they have to be ready to go within about a half an hour. And you would rotate through that as kind of like our kind of CQ or our staff duty now you would do today. So you would rotate off this every couple weeks on there. It was also very much based on the tactics that they had learned during the French and Indian War. And it's very much a merit system. And so, again, officers are picked based off merit. And then the tactics that they're using is stuff that they learned during the French and Indian War. And so a lot of this I kind of put on here is wilderness fighting. In some things you might see it as guerrilla fighting. They're used to doing the kind of the hit and run, firing from behind the trees, behind the walls, using trickery. They're used to evading away. As soon as they don't have the advantage, they'll melt back into the woods. And so it's very much a harassment style tactic that's what they had learned to do. I keep trying to hit the wrong button. I'm sorry. That siege army around Boston, known as the Army of Observation, sometimes known as the Boston Army, therefore, basically with the northern colonies, and so that being Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Connecticut. And they kind of came in that order. And so you have about 1,500 souls that are there initially, and then next thing you know, New Hampshire sends some guys down, Connecticut sends some guys down, Rhode Island sends some guys down, and they all put them under the command of Artemus Ward. He takes command of this army that's about 22,000 people strong there on the 23rd of April. This army is very much a flex, and there's a lack of coordination. It's very decentralized. Each one of these state militias is run by itself. Artemus Ward really doesn't have a lot of control over this. But also a lot of this, too, is, again, their militia. All right. A lot of the militia thing was to defend your home and family. So a lot of these guys can't stay very long before I've got to go back and tend to my farm and family. And so this was very much an ebb and flow army that flexed a whole lot. You have under here the Massachusetts Provincial Congress does appeal to raise the army. And that was the letter that Joseph Warren pens. He pens this in May, and it doesn't get to the Second Continental Congress until in June. A little bit about the colonies is before we go into the Second Continental Congress. As we said, the colonies themselves were very much autonomous. They had their own independent charters with England. They had their own economies that were independent of each other. And there was very much a diversity between the northern colonies and the southern colonies based off their economies. And so there was a lot of discrepancies or disparaging of how they felt about the colony and what they felt about as far as, like I said, the coercive acts. Some really thought that Boston was doing this upon themselves, and that was a Boston problem, right? We're good with the crown. But they never did have any type of representation. The colonies the British Crown pretty much left them alone if they were doing it, but they had no representation there. And that's what got me the one of the biggest parts that we're looking at. And so you're looking at an idea of colonial self-interest. They wanted to be left alone. They wanted to be able to run their economies as they saw fit, versus, hey, wanting to remain loyal to the crown. And as I said, this became really a national civil war on this. It was a real tug of war. And things like the Committee of Correspondence and Inspection and Safety put out, I want to say, propaganda. That was what it was for the day, to try to persuade more patriots and try to, again, boycott the loyalists. And if being a loyalist at the time, start to become a very precarious thing. There's also big concerns over race in the colonies. And so you had about 20% of the population was enslaved at this point. And some of the colonies, again, how do we work their slave populations versus how do you not work in slave populations? This same argument would play into the Army as well. And eventually the Second Continental Congress went with a 1/5 rule. And so that only 1/5 of the Army could be non-white at any one time. The Second Continental Congress itself. And so it stands up in Philadelphia in the May of 1775. It would become now the de facto national government for the rest of the war, all the way through 1783. They do agree to assume control of that army of observation in New England. And by doing so, what you did now is take that problem that was a Boston problem and you made it a national cause. It became the problem for all the colonies. And so that really kind of turned everything on its head. And so there was, again, we say concerns over regional commands, over race. All these things now are becoming really the play, because now we've got to figure out how we're going to orchestrate this national level cause into something. Kind of as a case in point, though, or a cool case in point, at this time, Georgia is not involved in the Second Continental Congress. So we don't send our first delegates here until July on there. And then also I put on here the date with the Continental Navy standing out. And so that happens in October of this year. But as we all know, on the 14th of June of 1775, the Second Continental Congress does establish what we now know as the United States Army. And so what they authorized to do is to take responsibility of that army, of observation, and also a militia that was standing up in New York of about 5,000 men. They resolved to immediately raise 10 companies of riflemen, and I put on here infantry because they were meant to fight as infantry soldiers, even though they were not armed with typical infantry weapons of the time. They would have been armed with a rifle, from Pennsylvania, 2 from Maryland, and 2 from Virginia. Then they also resolved, too, that they would appoint a commander-in-chief of this army, and then they would also establish the necessary support structure to support and operate this army. And so on the 16th of June, you actually have the formation of the Adjutant General Corps, the Engineer Corps, the Finance Corps, and the Quartermaster Corps. So with that, though, it makes the infantry the oldest branch in the Army by 2 days. Something we're very proud of. Also, as I said before, General Washington actually accepts his appointment as the Commander-in-General on the 17th. So he's selected, we always say that he is selected on the 15th. He's notified of his appointment on the 16th, and then he actually goes to Congress and accepts his appointment on the 17th on there. And then pretty much he immediately, within a week, he leaves for Boston after that. Also, on that same date, though, you have the Battle of Bunker Hill, or as many probably would know, the Battle of Breed's Hill. This happens on the afternoon, of the 17th. This is already kind of be a known fight And so the Army of Observation is hearing that the British are looking to use Charles Neck to break out of the siege. And so their thought is we're going to occupy this area, this peninsula, prior to the British can get in there. So the night of the 16th, William Prescott takes about 1,200 men, and they literally build a redoubt in one night. And they said this redoubt was so big, about 130 feet worth of wall, that was so high that they could stand and fire behind it. So it was at least almost a 6-foot walls that they were able to build in one night on there. So they had strong defensive positions. But what they actually chose to do, though, is actually to form up on Breeze Hill, which was a little bit smaller hill that was a little bit closer to actual Charleston. As daylight rose, General Prescott kind of realized, oh, wait a minute, I can be easily outflanked here because I've put myself too far out on this peninsula. And so they start building other earthworks to try to connect that, to kind of go down the hill, connect to the water, and they start trying to build earthworks now up on Bunker Hill as well. It takes over about 6 hours for the British to kind of go like, we need to do something about this. And at this time now, General Gage is supplemented by General Howe. He is actually the ranking guy there, but General Gage is still kind of the guy that's still in charge of this. They send over 1,600 men across on boats, and they really, as I kind of put here, overestimated their own abilities and underestimated their enemy. They had no respect for the Americans. They thought they would run, that they were untrained, and that they were just going to bowl them. And so you see the painting here of Bunker Hill of the 52nd Regiment of Foot just mechanically walking up this in the fields of fire, and they would assault 3 times before they could take Bunker Hill. And the Patriots, again, from a fortified position with equal numbers, were able to best them, and they didn't run. Only after they started running out of ammunition did they do a very slow withdrawal. As we said, General Warren is there. It's Private Warren. And he asked to be at the place where he knows the combat is going to be the heaviest, and that's at Breeds Hill at the redoubt. And he is there fighting. He's instrumental. He's renowned for saying that they thought that we wouldn't fight. We'll show them up there. It is known somewhere during the third assault, about the time that the Patriots are beginning to withdraw, that Dr. Warren is killed somewhere in there. He refuses to withdraw from the redoubt and tries to stay until the last. And somewhere along there, he is killed. His body really pretty much is defiled and degraded. He is bayoneted multiple times. The reports say over 50. Then they bury him in a shallow grave. It's also known a couple days later, the British return and they behead him on there. And so then his body is left like that. This is very much, as we kind of know, the British victory. But it was very much a Pyrrhic victory in that the British suffered almost 60% casualties, over 1,000 men that they lost on this assault, out of about 1,600, 1,700. But at the same time, the Patriots lost about 450. And so very much a Pyrrhic, but it did nothing to change the statistical or tactical situation around Boston. It did nothing. And so very much, like I said, a Pyrrhic victory for the British. And then, like I said, the news of Dr. Warren falling really galvanized the Patriot cause on there. His body would be found on here like 10 months later. And this is after the British would leave Boston in the spring of 1776. And Paul Revere and Joseph Warren's brother are the ones that go retrieve his body. And they actually are able to figure out who he is based off dental work that Paul Revere had done. And so Paul Revere was a silversmith, and he had actually done fillings in Dr. Warren's for his teeth. And that's how he's able to identify him. And so this actually becomes the first case of dental forensics in America. So Pretty cool. And we were talking about this a minute ago. Like I said, he was, at the time, 4 kids, and a fiance was taking care of him. His children and fiance were supposedly at the Adams farm with Abigail Adams at the time of the battle. And that's where they would reside for a good time after that. But again, you're talking a time before pensions or anything like this. And so the Second Continental Congress agreed to help finance the raising of these 4 children and take care of Mercy, along with John Hancock, John Adams, and an upstart that Dr. Warren had been very proud of, that bringing into the system and bringing in and getting a commission, and a guy by the name of Benedict Arnold. So Benedict Arnold would help pay for Dr. Warren's children. Kind of looking at the Continental Army. As we said before, on the 14th of June, the Congress accepted responsibility of that Army of Observation and a militia there that was forming in New York. And so together, that's about 28,000 militiamen that they're taking on. They also agreed to raise these 10 companies of riflemen. These companies right now are about 75 strong. They would have a captain, 3 lieutenants, 4 sergeants, 4 corporals, a trumpeter and drummer, and about 68 privates on there. So again, about 75 men strong for these 10 companies. Now, they were basically a militia. They were known and used to fighting in that wilderness style of fighting. And the plan now was to build this into a European-style professional army. And so that's what you have to now take and train these guys to do. And that's the only way that we're going to best the British, is to meet them on equal terms. And so that's what you have to start doing. All through June and July, the Continental Congress and General Washington are forming the different branches, as we said before. You have the Engineer Corps, Quartermaster Corps, Adjutant General Corps, all formed there 1st of June. Towards the end of July, you would have things like the Medical Corps and things like that were actually forming. By September, the Congress is actually building a plan to expand the Army. And so they were going to build another 26 infantry regiments, another regiment of riflemen, and then 1 of artillery. And so that would have been about another 20,000 that they would have had on here. The sieges continued all through this time period. And by the January of 1776, the siege army, again, as I told before, is very much an ebb and flow. It's actually down to as low as 8,000 people, which kind of, all right, the British by the spring of 1776, they actually leave Boston. They kind of find their position there untenable, and they're looking to move the fight up into New York area. What they kind of found interesting, we kind of still always complain about pay for the enlisted soldiers, but at least when I got a private, I wasn't getting $6.25. A couple of the things that I kind of take away from here is, again, they were very much already used to kind of a merit-based system, and they weren't used to a lot of the same kind of harsh punishments and very strict discipline that you would demand of a professional army of European style. That got to be a very hard thing, like so for a lot of young new Patriot soldiers to start having to learn. Most of these guys were very inexpensive, though, inexperienced, and they were very young. And a lot of them were, again, hey, I'm just looking for my adventure. Again, much like the 18, 19-year-old kids that come through here a lot of times. They're looking for their start. Want to put over here, so that is the colors of the 7th Regiment of Foot. That is the very first battle flag that the United States Army ever captured at Fort Chambly in October of 1777 or 1775. This is at West Point, and it's the flag itself. They're called the Alpha and Omega, and so this is the Alpha. And the Omega is the very last battle flag that was captured from Yorktown, and that was a Hessian regiment on there. Those flags are given to General Washington by the Second Continental Congress, and so they now reside at West Point on there. But this flag is actually captured. That New York Army that's forming, they're actually going up into Canada. So the very first Army operation is to invade Canada, and the hopes of making Canada the 14th colony. And so they're essentially trying to persuade Canada to join the Patriot cause, and we're going to do it by force. As we can see, you have the Battle of Quebec that happens, and Fort Chambly is real close to Montreal. But then the Battle of Quebec, as that force finally moves up that far, is the end of that, and you have General Montgomery that will pass there, and that becomes the end of that. The end of that campaign there. And so we actually end 1775 on a real down note for the Continental Army with a big, huge loss there at the Battle of Quebec. And then General Montgomery's force, they'll spend the rest of the winter there at Fort Chambly, and then they'll withdraw from there. But looking at some of the uniqueness of what 1775 brings for the Continental Army. One, it's that first step towards developing that professional force that will be an equal to the British Army, the most technologically advanced army of its time. And so that's those first steps towards doing that. But they're very much in ebb and flow steps, to say the least. There's a lot of successes in 1775, especially in the early months when you think of like Bunker Hill, things like this, that puts a lot of faith in our militia system, and probably maybe too much faith in our militia system. The death of Dr. Warren itself still was a galvanizing force, and the Committee of Correspondence put stuff out for him everywhere. And we'll show you a picture of one of these portraits in just a second. That decentralization of command structure that the militia was used to is still, like I said, again, a bit of a problem. You're trying to train professional soldiers now that are actually trained versus, hey, the guy we like the most. And this is still stuff that General Washington is having to work through. This militia organization structure is very resistant to change, much like our Army still today. And so, again, there's a lot of internal struggles that are happening in that 1775 year. The other part of this is they're honestly, most of the patriots still thinking this is going to be a short war. We'll show the British that we mean business. They'll leave us alone, and things will go back to the way they were. They'll relieve the coercive acts, and like I said, it'll be back to the status quo. And it's really not until the end part of 1775 that they're starting to realize that that's not going to be the case. And again, the Continental Army agreeing to, hey, we need to raise even more regiments. The cardinal sin, though, for that year was really this whole one-year enlistment period. And the militia, again, very much that ebb and flow. They would just leave to take care of their families. Got to take the crops in, and they would leave. So that got to be very much one of the cardinal errors of the day. Then I'll throw in here, too, you have Thomas Paine's Common Sense. That's published there in January of 1776. That is probably the document, and there's something like, and they said in 1776, there was something like 120,000 copies of that made for that time, which was huge. And that short pamphlet was probably the most influential document in convincing the patriots and Washington, the Continental Congress, that, okay, this isn't going to be a short war. Things aren't going to go back to the way they were. We need to start thinking about independence. And so his book gets published in January. And as we all know, the Declaration of Independence happens about 7 months later. The Fabian Defense. Fabian Defense is essentially an idea that you're never going to get yourself cornered and boxed in. And this is what General Washington had to do. And he's realizing this in 1775. And this is what he does all the way through the whole Revolutionary War, is not to get himself so engaged that he's committed and then he has his force destroyed. And a lot of times we start thinking about, did the British Army have all the advantages? No, they didn't. They might have the technological advantage. They might have had the experience and the discipline advantage. But honestly, the Patriots had an advantage as far as they were playing on their home court. They had people that were sympathetic to them, and they had the numbers advantage. But in order to maximize those, one, you had to keep the army together and never let it be destroyed. You always had to have that nucleus of the resistance. If the British Army could ever have got the Continental Army and quartered them and destroyed them, the whole rebellion would have died. And Washington realized that. So he had to practice his Fabian defense and evade that kind of like that self-committal engagement. And so he realized that he would have to continuously evade, keep his armies together as a whole. And the other one was only fight when you have all the advantages. And that really got to be Washington's MO during the whole war. A lot of that time, not everybody understood that. And some people started to doubt Washington's leadership through the whole course of the war. But he realized that the biggest part was to keep the army whole and intact and never let it get destroyed. Again, if so, the resistance would die. With that, I kind of appreciate everybody's kind attention. I turn your attention to John Trumbull painting. He was kind of known as the painter of the Revolution. And this is the death of Warren at Bunker Hill. And I think this is really, really cool when you think of how much of a galvanizing force he did. John Trumbull would do a painting of the death of Dr. Warren, and he would actually do one too, the death of General Montgomery from the Battle of Quebec. They were both very closely done. And you can see here General Gage's comment that Dr. Warren's death was equal to that of 500 militiamen. But what's also interesting to me, and maybe just me here, is what I find is, again, he became such a galvanizing figure. This painting itself, that's now in Boston, is done about 1713 to 1730. They don't know the exact date. But this is only one of a whole bunch of that John Trumbull was doing. And this is probably like the fourth copy of it now, kind of thought the copy on there. And so if these were going out as early as 1776, these engravings. But again, to make him a galvanizing figure, you had this painting. Does anybody know who James Wolfe is? British General James Wolfe. So he is also one of these galvanizing figures of the French and Indian War. And he was the young general officer that actually would seize Quebec and from the French. And he would die so in there. And he actually became one of the biggest heroes of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. And this is the painting of the death of James Wolfe. And it very much, to me, you see a whole lot of similarities in there. And again, just how much a painting and things like this, again, you didn't have the internet, became such a galvanizing force for a cause. And like I said, those two paintings together have always been very unique to me. But with that, is there any questions? 15. As far as like military accolades, no. He has received all kinds of other accolades. There's something like 4 monuments or statues to him. Numerous towns have been named after him and things like this. But no, he was never any like a military accolade. You didn't have anything like that even really at that time. But he has been very remembered. I think there are multiple full-size statues of him in Boston alone. As well. Yeah. Oh, thank you, ma'am.
I'm taking a multitude of facts and figures and presenting them in an incredibly interesting way.
Trying to put them into a story, right?
So much.
Yeah.
It is so interesting.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, it's a very in-depth story. It's hard to put into a 30-minute presentation. Yeah, you're right, Joe. But it is. There is the story of the individuals, and I think again as a museum, that's what we try to bring forward a lot is the story of those people, those individuals that were instrumental in doing so. But yeah, it's a very in-depth story to try to put in 30 minutes. But yeah, thank you though, sir.
Chris, when did you think the American Army began to turn things around in your favor to where we were winning the revolution?
That's a good question. And again, I know a lot of people would say, "Oh, the Valley Forge." I don't know if I'm a Valley Forge guy per se. Again, Saratoga, the Battle of Saratoga, which I actually have a spontoon that comes from, is definitely the turning point battle of the war, especially from the political and the international perspective of bringing the French into it. But I think maybe for the American Army as a whole, it would actually start to be there in 1778 when you actually started to have some string of victories. One that I always like is you had the development of the it just jumped out of my head. Essentially, development of the spring arm of elite infantry force, and they just jumped out of my head. And Anthony Wayne would actually lead this Continental elite force there in 1778, and then, of course, Lafayette would take it from there. But they had the Battle of Stony Point, and that was very much a tactical win and a sound tactical win there just outside of West Point. So I think it was when you start thinking of this, that 1778, 1779 time frame when, again, the French are starting to get involved, and the tactics and the training are starting to take root on there.
I guess there was a point when General Cornwallis thought, "Uh-oh, we're in trouble now. These Americans are whooping our butts here. We're in some serious trouble."
Well,
I don't know when that became.
and so really that changed with Bunker Hill. In some ways, Cornwallis, of course, not involved yet. But again, the British, as a whole, really took notice after Bunker Hill. You have General Gage, who's sent home in shame after that. And again, this is where the whole Margaret Gage never coming forth if she was a spy or not. She had to go home, and she's actually American-born, so she has to go home. Go back to England, leave her home of America, and now she resides in England after her husband died. And again, you're now living in England, and the widow of a British general officer. You're sure as hell not going to go, "Hey, I was helping the patriots," So, but like I said, General Gage is sent hessian after this, and really, this is too when the British start realizing, wait a minute, we're going to need more manpower. And we're going to have to go to the Germans and start recruiting these Hessian armies and stuff like that. So it's really, Bunker Hill was one of that eye-opener of, wait a minute, this isn't going to be easy even for them.
Hey, Chris, just a comment. Growing up in Massachusetts, the 4th grade field trips and the 5th grade field trips.
Yep.
One of the things I remembered was, so where the Bunker Hill Monument is in Boston, that's actually Breeds Hill. Where that marker actually
the big marker, right.
And if you go down Bunker Hill Ave about maybe a half a mile, you actually get to what is Bunker Hill.
Bunker Hill,
and there's like the St. Mary and Francis, there's a Catholic church there, and the cemetery that's behind it, I believe, has some of the casualties from the colonial side buried in that cemetery.
Wow.
But I know it's a Bunker Hill monument, but it's where it sits, that's actually
on Breeds Hill, which was closer to the end of the peninsula, Charles Neck, I guess, right?
Yeah, and then the Charlestown Navy Yard.
Yeah.
If you just below that, there's the Marine Barracks at the Charlestown Navy Yard where the Constitution is. that's the oldest continuously occupied Marine Corps barracks in the United States. I think it's like the late 1700s.
The 1700s. Yeah, cool.
No, great. It's awesome. I'm actually familiar.
Any other questions? Two, I've got some items up here on the table. Again, some of this is stuff that we use with our teaching collection, but I did bring out an officer's pontoon. And again, it kind of hallmark a little bit about the discipline, particularly in that British Army that you would have. And so an officer's pontoon, again, it was not a weapon as much as it was a signal of that leadership on the battlefield. And this was actually more of a aid for them to march their troops and keep their troops organized on there. But this one is actually one that belonged to what's called the unit called the Brunswickers. And so they were a German militia unit, much like the Hessians as we would all are familiar with. But this Brunswicker unit surrendered en masse and was at the Battle of Saratoga. And so this one was actually from Saratoga here as well.
Yeah, I've heard it, and I've read a number of places, about the grandized version of Paul Revere's contribution during his questionable ride.
Right.
He may not have notified anybody, actually, that there's other people that did the notification.
Yeah.
But the curious thing is that we continue to say the British are coming, It's kind of a misnomer because they were all British. It was the regulars are coming.
Right. Yeah.
So, part of that myth of Paul Revere, we continue the British are coming.
Yep. And he's still best well known for that of all things. Again, thanks to grade school. But again, I would really think, to me, one of the things I have on there was his engraving that he did as a silversmith of the Boston Massacre, and I think his contributions really then was more that for that than it ever was for the ride. 250 years later. So I think that's kind of, and another one that's odd is, again, I kind of had it up there, the Battle of Bunker Hill and the whole don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes, is kind of where we all learned that one. And again, that's not contributed to any officers that was up fighting at Bunker Hill, and it's pretty much a misnomer. But what it does, though, it does speak to the discipline that the British Army did not take into account that the militiamen did have on that day. They were disciplined in their fighting, and they stayed all the way until the ammunition was gone, and they withdrew orderly from the redoubt and withdrew, and like I said, in very much an orderly fashion. So it is very much a testament to the idea that they fought a disciplined fight, and they let the British come into their killing fields and into their trap, and the British paid for it. And there's British officers been known as like, hey, if we fight any more battles like this, there ain't going to be a British Army to be had on there. With that, if there's any other questions, I do appreciate everybody's attention. Hopefully you enjoyed the talk. We'll have some more. And if you have any questions with any of the material up here, we'd be glad to let you look at them. Thank you.